Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats as the event is about to begin.
Mesdames et messieurs, veuillez prendre place puisque la séance débutera dans quelques instants.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. I hope you had a refreshing break and some lunch. And we're now moving into the first of the breakout sessions that are taking place this afternoon in Finance and Biodiversity Day. And this first breakout session is on the theme of mainstreaming biodiversity within public policies. And it's an attempt to look at some ongoing initiatives and achievements. I should introduce myself. I'm Jeremy Eppel. I work at a not-for-profit called Nature Finance, whose mission is to align global finance with nature-positive, equitable outcomes. So very much at the focus of greening of finance. So hopefully relevant to what we're going to discuss today. I have an excellent panel alongside me. And what we're hoping to do is have as interactive a discussion as a format like this allows about these issues of mainstreaming and public policy from a number of different actors who operate in this field, but also those who are slightly more in the private sector where dialogue with public policy is clearly vitally important, as we were hearing this morning. So without going into too much detail, the essence of what we're trying to look at this afternoon is to see how we can get mainstreaming of biodiversity, that's to say integrating it into the lifeblood of public policy and planning at the national level in particular, including in things like national development plans and strategies, coordination between ministries and institutions in national budgets, and how in practice financial flows, investments and so on at the national level can be aligned with the expectations, with the ambition we all hope we'll see very soon in the Global Biodiversity Framework. So if you're looking for a bit of the Global Biodiversity Framework to which this attaches, I'd say it's not only in goals, but it's probably target 14. It's where does public policy meet the ambition of the Global Biodiversity Framework? And importantly, where does finance, public and private, have a role to play in advancing that dialogue and advancing implementation of biodiversity? So let me start by really asking each of our four panelists to say a little bit about some of the things that they see happening within their own organization in order to help advance that policy, in order to help advance a dialogue in public policy in the countries in which they're operating, and to help develop this theme of mainstreaming. So Vanessa Ushi from the African Development Bank, acting from the Natural Resources Management and Investment Center of the ADB. I'd be really interested to hear your perspective on this, Vanessa. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you for inviting the African Development Bank to this dialogue. So as you said, we are adopting various ways to mainstream biodiversity and nature in our operations. I'll talk about several thematic areas. First, on knowledge and policy analysis. We've produced some knowledge work on how African countries have adopted or their experiences with mainstreaming biodiversity. So last week here at the COP, we launched a report in collaboration with WWF and was looking at African countries' experiences with implementing the Aichi biodiversity targets and implementing the national biodiversity strategy action plans. And it was very informative because it shows where the gaps are really and what actions should be taken going forward to close these gaps. So some of the issues we're seeing from this analysis are around resourcing, capacity, knowledge building, the need for consistent technical support from MDBs to support and help countries to really scale up their biodiversity finance. On the other hand, we're also taking efforts to align with global standards. Of course, last year, the AFDB was one of 10 MDBs that signed on to the joint statement on nature. And so we've now done an initial analysis of our inventory to see opportunities for mainstreaming through nature-based projects. And this analysis found around 39 different projects that could be considered as being nature-based with a value of $2 billion. So there are opportunities emerging to really do this at scale at country level. Thirdly, is how we can tailor finance and investment flows towards financing biodiversity. The latest replenishment of the African Development Fund, which is our concessional arm, raised $8.9 billion for the next cycle, which is from 2023 to 2025. And we've introduced an innovative platform called the Climate Action Window, which is really an accelerator. And this includes some key priorities on biodiversity conservation and management. Next, we have some flagship projects, such as the Great Green Wall and our interventions in the Horn of Africa, the Congo Basin, and other critical ecosystems in Africa, which again are helping us to scale the level of finance that is needed to protect and to restore nature in these critical areas. And then finally, at a strategic level, our frameworks, whether it's on climate change, natural resources management and investment, even on fragility or the private sector, we see the increasing importance of investing in green solutions which prioritize nature. And specifically on the natural resources strategy, we have a core pillar now on valuing natural capital. So these are just some examples of how we're engaging with the whole question of biodiversity finance, whether it's from knowledge generation, policy analysis, the way we tailor our financial flows, and how we support countries to achieve their objectives. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. That's very interesting. Can I just ask one sort of supplementary point to that? I mean, in terms of when you, and you clearly have thought this through very well in the bank, when you are engaging with your client countries, how receptive do you find them? How tuned in are they to your clearly tuned in thinking?
There is a growing awareness of protecting biodiversity and nature. I think what is missing is more of a joined up approach, because you could say these types of questions are normally domiciled in ministries such as environment and even climate change, and we need to have a whole of government, whole of society approach. So I think the awareness is there, but going forward to be more effective, we need to be more joined up in our thinking and practice.
And are your conversations mainly with finance ministries or with environment ministries or with both?
They're with both, but on different sectors. So that's my point, that we need to find ways of bringing all of the sectors together in a very effective platform.
Okay, thank you. Well, maybe that's a good point of entry to ask Tracy Cumming, who's a senior advisor with UNDP's Biofin, the Biodiversity Finance Project, to tell us how it works for you and when you're trying to have these conversations with governments about thinking across the piece, thinking in a whole of government way. What sort of experience have you got to share with us, Tracy?
Thanks, Jeremy. So UNDP Biofin's core purpose is to work with countries to help close the funding gap, this buzzword that we've been hearing a lot of for the last 10 days. We develop biodiversity finance plans in partnership with ministries of environment and ministries of finance, as well as other ministries that are relevant in that country. The Biofin Steering Committee, for example, will have both of those ministries present and engaging throughout the project. Biodiversity finance plans include a range of what we call finance solutions, essentially mechanisms, that spread across public and private, short-term and long-term, but there is always a substantial focus on transformational change, on sustainable approaches, which often means changing or creating legislation or policies or even institutions. Of course, Biofin's approach doesn't stop at a nice plan. We currently work in 41 countries, and I'd like to give just a few examples of the type of implementation we have in those countries, specifically around affecting public policy. So in Kazakhstan, we have been working with national government to create an enabling environment for biodiversity offsets. There were no offsets in the country. Nothing like that had been done before. There wasn't a strong understanding of how to do that. The work involved changing 2 separate pieces of legislation. It involved developing guidelines, working with the government and a policy, and then capacity building. So we worked hand in hand with the government at all those levels, at capacity building, legislation level, and guideline and policy level. Just a few other little examples. In Mexico, we're working closely with the central bank on disclosure frameworks. In Zambia, we've developed a global framework to issue green bonds. Well, we've worked with government to do that, and as well as develop fiscal benefits to reduce tax earnings from interest collected from green bond investments. In Thailand, we've helped to create a visitor fee that can be then channeled into natural capital protection. And in Botswana, which has a really strong reliance on ecotourism, we've worked with the national government to revise the protected area fees, which haven't been updated in 20 years. Just a few examples, but there's a wealth of examples of how we've worked with the government. The last thing I'd like to add is we're currently starting to work with our countries, with all of them, to identify harmful subsidies in each country in a range of sectors as a first step to then figuring out how to reduce the harm that subsidies cause to biodiversity. And I'm mentioning this because it's a very difficult thing to do. We all know it was an IT target, nothing was done. And we're able to come in and work with government and build trusting relationships to say, let's tackle the hard things that have a real impact.
Thank you, Tracy, for reminding us just how important preventing harmful expenditure is, whether it's publicly funded or simply inadvertently caused by investments, public or private. And that point on subsidy reform, subsidy repurposing, subsidy reduction where it's harmful, we know there are very, very significant quantities of harmful subsidies. The figures are at least 500 billion a year in terms of just agriculture and energy, potentially harmful subsidies, possibly quite a bit more. And it's one of those discussions that is also very, very important in the context of the GBF and in Target 18, getting that message right. There was an Aichi target, but frankly, honestly, progress has been pretty limited. And we know it's a very difficult cross-government issue. So thank you for raising it, because I think it's important that we don't kid ourselves that these things are easy. Ramzi, if I could, Ramzi Issa from Credit Suisse in New York. I think you're kind of the one on the panel who's not from the public sector, as it were. But I think all the better for that, because this discussion today in Finance Day is really about how does the finance sector engage with the CBD, which has traditionally, and I've seen it from my own experience in the past, been very much in its own world. And therefore, getting people who are in the real world of the market and financial institutions in through these halls is very interesting and helpful. But I know that you've also worked directly in Credit Suisse in doing things with governments. So you're, as it were, at the cutting edge between the public and the private. And it'd be very interesting, I think, just to hear some of your experience and perspectives on how you've been able to work with governments, how you've been able to influence their thinking about getting nature into their financing.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy, and also thanks to everyone for attending the session today against the semi-final for the World Cup. So good show. So in terms of CS, so we do kind of two things. The first is through research, obviously, which we put out, which I won't focus too much because that's not my area of expertise. The second is through financing, right? So we've done a number of financing transactions spanning terrestrial and marine ecosystems. And I would say that CS, we've been, I think, a leader amongst banks kind of in this sector with some very kind of landmark transactions. So just to kind of give you an example of some deals that we've done, announced over this year. So earlier this year, we announced a transaction with the World Bank and the GEF for the world's first wildlife conservation bond, which channels funding to conservation and links the returns to investors with a specific outcome. In this case, it was the growth rate of endangered black rhinos in South Africa. The kind of other transactions that we've done, which are closer to my heart, are some debt conversions that we did with Belize and more recently with Barbados. And those transactions, we worked very closely with governments, both the finance and environmental divisions, to effectively bring kind of a transaction, bringing this transaction together. So what did we do on our side? So obviously we transformed into a transaction whereby the core purpose of the transaction was to generate funding for, in this case, marine conservation. So that was the environmental angle. But to kind of attract the finance division, we said that it's not just funding for the environment, but there is also fiscal relief or debt relief associated with the transaction. So the debt conversions, which I'm sure most people are familiar with, it's the sovereigns are refinancing, in this case, commercial sector debt at cheaper rates. And in the case of Belize, was also able to retire a lot. It's only Eurobond at a significant discount, which also resulted in a debt to GDP decrease of around 12%. So from the Ministry of Finance point of view, these transactions are kind of what we call in finance a liability management, right? They're managing their external debt stock. And here what we're doing is integrating kind of the benefits of actually reinvesting or investing into the environment, along with the financial benefit in the sense that it was helping to reduce debt service. So all else equal, the budget of the countries were able to save. Was able to save as a part of implementing these transactions. So those are kind of some of the things that we've done, and I think there's been a lot of excitement both on other governments around the world. Obviously, in these transactions, we've worked with DFIs. In the case of Belize, it was the DFC. In the case of Barbados, it was the IADB. But we've also been working with nonprofits, environmental nonprofits, obviously the experts on the crafting the environmental programs to bring kind of real, incredible environmental impact to the countries.
I mean, that's a very interesting example, I think, of what in this community has been called innovative finance, but much misunderstanding in the past about what innovative financial instruments could be. And the idea that you can meaningfully and with significant financial benefit combine the thinking of the financial sector and the thinking of the environmental sector, if you like, in that way is very encouraging. Do you think that the process by which that came about, was it in somehow, how can I put it, was it somehow organic, or did somebody go to the government and say, have you thought about doing this? I mean, was it as it were the private sector that said, you could restructure your debt in this way and get some environmental spin-off and benefits for nature or climate as well, and you do a lot for your own fiscal situation and potentially your credit rating as well, I guess, over time. Or did it kind of just emerge out of a conversation? I'm just fascinated by how these things actually kind of get started.
Yeah, so it's a very good question. I think to some extent, to a large extent, actually, in the case of Belize, a lot of this is, let's say, originating from the the NGO sector, where it's kind of the age-old problem is programs need funding, need long-term funding, because these aren't, 1-2 year projects. These are, 15, 20 year plus projects. And there was the question is, well, how do you deliver consistent funding so that the programs can be implemented for long-term and achieve the outcomes that they wanted. So in the case of Belize, the Nature Conservancy kind of announced kind of a Blue Bond for Conservation program, which took the idea of debt conversions, which have been around for 40 years. Obviously, prior debt conversions were more on a bilateral basis, so sovereign to sovereign or NGO to sovereign, but on a much smaller scale. In the case of Belize, it was a $360 million financing, which retired $550 million of debt. But that was an idea was an NGO saying, how do we fund these programs, and how can we leverage the financial markets to basically enhance or expand the benefit that we being the NGOs bring to the environmental programs of the country. So then our kind of role was, it's a fantastic idea. Math makes complete sense, right? There's a winner. The country benefits, the environmental sector benefits, and also investors benefit because they're looking for, real impact type of transactions. So our kind of role is to say, great idea. How can we integrate it into an investable asset to basically leverage and access the capital markets in a way that generates the ultimate financial benefits?
Well, that's really interesting and encouraging, because I think unless we really do leverage the capital markets, we're never going to get the resources that we need to bridge the financing gap, as it's often described, that is at the heart of the challenge of delivering on the global biodiversity framework. So hearing about that gives one hope. And I think the ability to scale that is very, very hopeful. So let's come back to that in a minute. And meanwhile, though, I'd like to turn to Alicia from CAF, and perhaps tell us a little bit about the work you're doing there, Alicia Montalvo, and the kind of priorities you have, including perhaps on nature-based solutions, but more broadly, if you'd like to give us a sort of perspective on how you engage with the countries in which you operate, which I think is quite a number in Latin America.
There are now?
Yeah, push the button. Yeah.
Sorry. Thank you very much for inviting CAF to participate in this session. CAF has now 21 countries. We are the development bank of Latin America. And what we say is not we are a bank for Latin America, and our owners are also Latin American countries. And I think this makes a big difference. The shareholders are the clients. So they define their priorities, but then you have to translate these priorities in the day-to-day discussion. Sometimes you can see some incoherences between the mandate we have received and the real discussion we have with the ministers. Vanessa was clear that ministers of finance sometimes are not so much aligned with the ministers of environment or energy. So our role is to really understand how these values, the biodiversity values that we want to include and mainstream, are really integrated in the national plans. And every single country is different. And I think that our responsibility is to understand how they work to integrate these values. Is perhaps in a national plan. That's why we are requesting and saying that these plans are very important for us to have these national plans for finance biodiversity at the national level, because it's the way they can coordinate themselves. Otherwise, you need to pick up the different pieces in the agriculture sector, tourism sector, fishing, and this is the challenge for us, and we cannot preempt what they want. I think it's important that to understand how the values are integrated. In the discussions, we try to prioritize, we try to mainstream, and the first challenge, of course, is also to mainstream it in our own policies and actions. We are in this process right now. CAF is really trying to increase the relevance of biodiversity in our risk instruments, in our environmental safeguards, to make clear that we all share the same language, because what is clear for climate change maybe is not so clear for biodiversity values. What do we mean by values? And also at the same time, when we are talking about biodiversity, this is a global challenge, but it has a very local impact. And it's what really matters in our conversation. What is the impact of losing biodiversity in your agriculture, in your tourism, in your fisheries, in the quality of life of people? That's why it's so important to talk with local communities, indigenous communities. They have different values. So you need to integrate all these values. In our case, it's not, of course, the same, and I guess that is the same in other institutions, to talk with, for instance, Argentina or any Caribbean country. The idiosyncrasy is totally different. So this is our challenge, to really understand and to make possible that the countries have the tools to define the priorities, and also the ownership on these priorities. You cannot impose what they should do or what they have to do. So it's really very important, and that's why the GBF is very, very crucial for us, as far as we have some common understanding on what are we trying to do. Once we have this direction, we can bring also private investment. It's important that we all know where we are, and there is a determination on that, a leadership on that. Then we can define the instruments, and where are the weaknesses and strengths. So this is now a big challenge for all of us, but a shared challenge, I guess.
That's great. And it sounds like you've really started to think about how to go about this with 21 client countries. It's quite large. And have you found particular sort of things that make it easier to do that? What are the things that have really helped you in that process, and the obstacles you've had to overcome?
The most important is to be there. You cannot decide from an office. You have to decide listening to the people, involving local communities in the conversation, making sure that those who are talking with you really represent the values. So that's why the difference between the ministers, the sectoral ministers, and the finance ministers is relevant. We need to create environments that make possible they talk with each other. What is easy for us then is to have this kind of frameworks where really we can talk. We all know that there are 21 targets we want to implement, and in the context of the GBF, this is very important. That's why it's so important to have this discussion formally concluded. By this means, we can then be involved in a dialogue where we are not in trying to understand, what do you mean by value? No, we all know what are we referring to. I think this is very important, the language and the national accounting systems to use the same rules. I think this is key.
So is it really the case that when you have a dialogue with one of your countries, you, as it were, you would start with the GBF and you say, these are the things that your country has agreed to internationally. Yeah. Now we have to think about how you're going to implement them and mainstream biodiversity into those policies? I mean, is it as practical as that?
Very much. Well,
okay.
I say, no, it's not, this is the GBF, this, how are you trying to implement the GBF in your country?
Yes.
This is the first question.
Yeah.
And then once they have the instruments, perhaps one single plan, or perhaps a mainstreaming these targets in the different national plans, in the different sectors. Once you understand how they are doing that, then you can be involved in this conversation and perhaps trying to work on a sectoral basis, on an integrated basis. So it's not, we have this GBF here, it's how are you trying to implement this? And then we can be involved in this dialogue.
Okay, well, that's a good message. If any there won't be any negotiators in the room, but if they're listening somehow through the screens, that message gets through, that people actually are sitting up and taking this into a practical level of implementation, and so it's very important that they get it right. Okay, thank you. Vanessa, I wonder if I could turn back to you and sort of ask you to build a little bit on what you said earlier, and perhaps tell us what you think some of the biggest challenges are to try and integrate biodiversity thinking into your investments in other sectors like agriculture, which obviously is very closely significantly impacting on biodiversity if it's not done right, infrastructure and the other areas you operate in, and if there are any particular barriers you face in those sectors that you've been struggling with or managed to overcome. I think it'd just be interesting, how does it work when you're thinking outside the biodiversity frame, but nevertheless trying to get biodiversity into key sectors where you're investing or operating?
Okay, thank you, Jeremy. One of the most obvious challenges, of course, is what we have as MDBs have faced, which is a lack of metrics and guidelines, because we need to have a common understanding of what is nature sensitive or nature positive, and actually having systematic guidelines on how biodiversity could be mainstreamed in other sectors. So, how did we overcome this challenge? I think for every MDB, of course, we have our integrated safeguards, which are used to design and to implement projects. And we had to go back to the drawing board to see how our safeguards framework could be updated. So very recently, we've now mainstreamed biodiversity by including an operational safeguard on biodiversity conservation and protecting natural habitats. And that gives us room to actually ensure that when we're designing and executing projects, we're already taking into consideration the impacts on biodiversity. Another thing is how we can make the business case for investing in biodiversity. And we've tried to do this through partnerships in order to address the knowledge gap on the value and the benefits of natural capital. So in 2020, we created or co-created with the Green Growth Knowledge Partnership a program called Mainstreaming Natural Capital in African Development Finance. And this has four components. The first is trying to integrate natural capital in infrastructure finance. And we had a pilot looking at some projects which the bank was financing in Tanzania, a hydropower project, and in Mozambique, in the Pemba Corridor, an infrastructure project. And we were able to identify all the biodiversity factors surrounding the projects themselves. And we did an analysis, and this was actually supporting the investment decision. So the idea is that you put all of these factors on the table so that by the time that project is getting towards the approval, this actually puts all the risks and benefits on the table for decision makers to take the best decision in the interest of the environment, of the communities, but also the performance of that project over time. Because these risks are things that would impact the project delivery and the returns for the bank and investors. So it's in our best interest to address these risks upfront. Another element of that project is looking at how we can build a business case for natural capital with MDBs. And this is part of the conversations we've been having with our sister MDBs before and even during this COP. The next element is looking at how we can integrate natural capital in sovereign credit and risk ratings. We feel that Africa's natural capital is undervalued and underappreciated, and that if this were to be reflected in the sovereign credit ratings of countries, this would actually affect their positions and their ability to leverage new capital. Finally, an element on training and capacity building. So we have this model called the Natural Capital Academy, and it's actually training policymakers and officials on natural capital accounting and assessment methods. We've been able to run a series of workshops in Mozambique and recently in Kenya with the cohorts of policymakers with curricula which we develop with our partners to help them adopt these methods in taking the right decisions. So the point is that we recognize that if there's an underappreciation of how Africa's natural capital could be valued, making that business case requires, first of all, looking at how we finance projects, how we also work with our sister organizations and other financiers to put a greater emphasis on nature in our portfolios, and how we can look at African countries' positions in terms of their risk and credit profiles. And then finally, building that capacity so that they can take the right decisions. So in this way, we understood the problem of how we are approaching biodiversity and nature in our operations, in our lending, and our engagements with countries. And these are some of the steps that we've taken to try to address these challenges.
Thank you, Vanessa. That's a very interesting range of issues that you've highlighted there, all of which I'd sort of be interested in hearing more about. But maybe I should just restrain myself to two. I mean, on the sovereign credit ratings and how understanding and valuing natural capital can improve a country's sovereign credit rating. How have you gone about helping your client countries undertake that? Is it sort of practical tools so that they can do natural capital assessments, natural capital accounting? How does the dialogue then, how does that information then flow out, if you like, to the people who are going to make those credit ratings in the markets? So, I'd be interested in what you've actually been able to do in that space so far. I know it may be early days.
It's early days. Well, we started having a dialogue with the credit rating agencies, and we were surprised when they said, "Oh, actually, this is a good idea," because they had been thinking along those lines. The issue is just to have a practical use case, which demonstrates what we're trying to do. And of course, as you said, it's about building the capacity. So it links to other elements of the programs. But we intend to produce more analysis on this in due course because we see that there's some receptiveness from the financing institutions. And I was really excited to hear what you said about, the support to the debt deal in certain countries. So we see this uptake, and it's really about having more analysis to deepen that and applying that to Africa. But it's early days as yet. Yeah.
Thank you. Maybe I'll save my second question, but actually pass it over to Ramsey, if I may, kind of to build on that, because she's thrown you the ball in a way. Because I think the question is, if you're thinking about building natural capital into debt and sovereign credit ratings and other financial ways of looking at the world, how does that help you, if it does, when you're thinking about the kind of bonds you've been building? Does it? Clearly it improves the fiscal position potentially of the country, but how have you been able to use the natural capital enhancement or the natural capital protection angle in thinking about the credit ratings that will be applied to countries where you're working and doing deals?
Yeah, thanks for the question and passing the ball. So, I think it's a very interesting idea, because I think from the speaking from the investor's point of view, I think it actually aligns with how investors are actually thinking about sovereign credit risk, in particular, because in some of the countries, obviously, the environmental is an important element, right? And the two transactions I mentioned in Belize and Barbados and others that are being looked at, that is actually a core aspect of the analysis, the country risk analysis for which an investor is looking at. So I think from their point of view, that's how investors that we're speaking with on these transactions are thinking about. Excuse me. So I think it's having kind of a clear rule book or methodology is what's important. Because I think at the end of the day, to scale, which is I think also another important aspect in all of this, is scaling everything up. Standardization is super important. Open transparency in terms of how things are measured, accounted for, how information can be accessed. So yes, and methodology is a key aspect of that.
That's great. I think that's really helpful reminders to people in the public sector that these things can be scaled and will be. And are you seeing increasing appetite now after these early deals for more and more of them? Is this something you're beginning to sort of either get directly involved in or see others?
Yes, we are seeing. It's also a statement that Vanessa mentioned earlier, which is that it's we're moving from policy to practical, right? And I think now when governments are thinking about these types of transaction or even biodiversity or funding for programs, it's not just a theoretical, it's not just an idea that makes sense, but actually there is ways that it can be converted into cash, programs, protections, etc. So it is like the proof of concept. And I think one of the things that I should add in my earlier statement of how did that deal come about is also it's in some sense crisis also brings about solutions. So in 2020 we had COVID, and that was also kind of that was a crisis event for developing countries, and they're still dealing with the after effects of that, right? So and that kind of precipitated countries to say, look, we have to address this issue, and now we're combining it with another kind of key issue for developing countries, which is funding for conservation or biodiversity. So,
and when those deals are designed, what kind of performance indicators need to be built in? I mean, are these deals which have key performance indicators inherent, or are you not seeing that?
Yeah. So in some of these transactions, there are, I would say, it's like two elements. One is national or federal level policy implementation. So, in the transactions that we've done, they're, announcing a marine protected area for up to 30%, right? So that's one of the main, say, KPIs. Yeah. There are other kind of KPIs related to, sustainable fisheries, blue economy, tourism, etc. And these are, I call them policy level or federal level policy commitments. Then there are individual projects that are not necessarily not at the federal level. They're decided upon and funded through the financial transaction, which takes in the stakeholders of government, NGOs, and also local population, whether it's fisher-folk associations, businesses that also depend on the blue economy, basically all the key constituents that somehow have a relationship with that ecosystem.
Great, thank you. Very interesting. Maybe Alicia, I could turn to you again now. I mean, are you seeing these kind of financial instruments starting to appear in the countries in which you're working? I mean, some of them, I think are of those countries, but and what are you able to do to kind of encourage that process and help people think about these new sources of finance, these new, more innovative ways of combining public policy, economic policy, and environmental priorities, addressing biodiversity and climate risk?
We have seen a very increasing interest on these kind of instruments, but at the same time, we feel somewhat the lack of capacities or ability to really manage all this supply and noise. They look around, they see around, and they say, well, some countries feel that they have not the capacities to really deal with so much offer, and kind of mistrust sometimes. So I think that what you said is crucial. We need to provide them with the instruments, national accounting related to natural resources. We need to work in both lines. First, to have the instruments for a measurement of natural resources themselves, but also to the economic, the value of the ecosystem services, which is not easy, but we need to develop methodologies. So by having the double line of natural resources and economic value of these ecosystemic services, we can really begin to have a different level of conversation with financial institutions once they understand that there is a value, which is not the same that a price in the ecosystemic services. They have a different level of dialogue with these financial institutions. But sometimes I think that with all this idea of credits associated to ecosystemic services, the markets related to that, the bonds, there are so many instruments that we are all discussing about them, but without really understanding what could be the underlying value of these credits that could be in the market. So I think that the dialogue is hardly beginning, But a lot of instruments have to be developed to really make it easy to understand what are we talking about. And again, are we talking about the same things when we refer to ecosystemic services? Are we referring to fishery? Are we referring to water? Are we referring to... So I think that we see a lot of interest, but still we also see kind of not exactly mistrust, but reluctancy to really be involved in these conversations without having enough tools to really have the level of dialogue they would like to have. I think this is our responsibility, how to create the spaces for this dialogue take place in a equitable manner.
That's clearly very important, and it's a role that you obviously are trying very hard to play. But it sounds like your own ability to deal with these new issues and your own capacity to help your client countries deal with them is limited. So I guess platforms or initiatives out there in the wider world which are focused on particular aspects of this can be really helpful to you, whether it's some biodiversity credits or in addressing sovereign debt issues. I mean, these are the kind of things which I think real value can be added by the sort of initiatives that are going on elsewhere.
By all means, yes. We cannot do that in an isolated manner. Even though we are the most intelligent in the world, we need to be...
That's for sure.
We need to work in platforms. We need to really be able to exchange views, to exchange approaches, to talk with private sector, public sector. I think that we, in an isolated manner, any of us can't do that. It's impossible. So I think it's important. All the platforms that now we see that are increasing will be very useful for all of us.
Okay, that's encouraging for some of us who are working in some of those areas. Tracy, maybe you could kind of give us a slightly more zoomed out view, because you look at a lot of countries in Biofin, and I think you're going to be looking even more in the future, which is great. But, you know, what do you see as some of the things that need to happen for countries to be able to get their heads around these important but relatively unfamiliar kinds of approaches to financing and protecting their nature? I mean, and how can Biofin help?
So I'm hearing a lot of what I want to say from the other speakers, and that's incredibly encouraging. So firstly, don't stop at the why. We've made the case. I know we need to keep making the case, but that is step one. Focus on the how. Focus on practical solutions that are unique for that country, based on that context, to understand how we can change something, how to explain different mechanisms, and how it would work in that particular context. So have that approach rather than just making the case for mainstreaming biodiversity. Operate with a capacity building mindset, and I want to have some humility when I say this. All of us are coming with our own expertise. We are operating in a space that brings together multiple different worlds that are all complex and need to remain complex. They can't be oversimplified. So come in with humility and a capacity building mindset. Understand that these are long processes. It's not a parachute in, wave a magic wand, and suddenly your funding gap is gone and we can pat ourselves on the back and go. It's a long-term process. And from an organization or a program like Biofin, we're extremely grateful that our donors understand this too, that we need to work for many years with government, work alongside national government, understanding their priorities, looking for multiple benefits, where biodiversity is just one part, and create community. So, you know, this is all these different actors. We all come with our own thing, and in the Biofin program, we've created a community of programs and different country projects where we learn from each other and we inspire each other, because this work can be hard and sometimes you need a bit of inspiration. So those are my offerings.
Okay, and you're clearly making real progress in that. What are your sort of aims in the next phase to try and really cement some of that, working on the how? I mean, in terms of where Biofin could go.
Well, as you mentioned, we're getting a whole lot of new countries in through GEF funding. So we're starting from the beginning with many countries, working them through to get to a biodiversity plan. With our existing countries, we're focusing on a range of things, but I'd like to highlight a renewed focus on the finance sector, and that involves private private and public finance sector and figuring out how we can help countries there, a focus on harmful subsidies, and maybe like less catchy things like working on results-based budgeting, which seems a bit tedious, but actually has massive implications across government budgets. So just a handful of things, but it's hard to pinpoint one or two because our whole model is what's needed in this country.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Well, best of luck with all of that. It's going to be a big task, but I think particularly after the GBF is agreed, as we hope, in an ambitious way in the next few days, you'll have your work cut out. So we'll look forward to seeing how it shapes up. We're coming close to the end of this afternoon's discussion, which I found very interesting. I hope our audience have too. But I wouldn't want to leave it without sort of asking you all, because you're all involved in different ways in either being part of the public policy dialogue or influencing it, whether you're directly or indirectly involved as a public or a private institution. But I'd really be interested to sort of hear your closing thoughts on what do you think would be most helpful to you? Not necessarily the exact language in the text, but the kind of signals that you want to hear from the Global Biodiversity Framework. So this is a chance to kind of not influence the negotiations, but make sure that osmotically, through osmosis, the idea of what would be helpful to you reaches those other rooms not so far from here, in order to help your work. I mean, so keep it focused, if you like, on what you're trying to do and what would, the week after next, give you the most impetus if that was somehow embodied in this framework that we've all been talking about for several years. Alicia, why don't you go first, because you're close.
Okay, I was thinking that the most helpful thing would be to have kind of successful result where everyone could feel more or less comfortable. Of course, we have not reached everything, but we have made progress. And I think this is important. This signal is that the community has been able to agree on a real good basis that make us understand that we are moving forward. I think for us could be, we understand that the result will have some shortcomings, but at the same time, if the idea of making progress, even limited, could be really very useful for all of us. I mean, in our case, for Latin American countries to move forward. We are talking about something that is real. So let's move, let's identify tools. I think for us could be very useful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Vanessa.
So thank you. From my perspective, I think looking at the global biodiversity framework, the right level of ambition can catalyze new investments. And we've all said we struggle with how to make that business case convincingly. But this is a framework that helps us to articulate it very clearly to countries, to investors, to all the stakeholders involved. So I think it will actually help us mobilize resources at scale. Since that has been a gap, we talk about financing. I can say it 3 times: financing, financing, financing. So having this framework that really clearly states what the issues are and how NDBs can and private sector can mobilize resources at scale will be very helpful, will help facilitate the investments, will reduce the transaction costs of making those types of investments. And I think it could actually help us innovate and create new de-risking vehicles to make nature positive investments at scale. I think from the African perspective, of course, the idea of the whole of government, whole of society approach. So having a kind of national biodiversity strategy financing plan, this helps us again to mainstream this within our existing programming so that we're not reinventing the wheel and we're efficiently deploying capital where it's needed. I think it's a catalyst on the whole, and it will certainly bring about more innovation. The good thing is that we're taking steps, whether it's in the public or private sector, to be innovative. So this actually pushes us to go further and to do more on biodiversity.
Thank you. And on the basis that this is a fairly gender balanced or slightly overbalanced panel, if I can put it like that, I'm going to let the third lady have the next to last word, and then I'm going to invite the gentleman at the end to have the last word. Well, I'll actually have the last word, but he can come next. So Tracy, what about you? What would you, without losing your job, hope to see in the GBF that would really accelerate the messages that Biofin can help implement?
I mean, we keep hearing it. We need an ambitious agreement. And I'd like to say we need an ambitious agreement across all goals and all targets. We're talking about resource mobilization, relevant targets, but all of them need to be ambitious. We need clear signals to the finance sector and to the private sector so that they know what's coming and they can act accordingly. We need signals for policy change where appropriate, and we need sufficient resources committed. So it's a big ask, and I know there's only a few days left, but that's really what we need.
Okay, well, I expected nothing less, so thank you for that. Ramsey, I'm going to say, you're a relative newcomer, as most of the finance sector is, I think it's fair to say, to these kind of discussions. It's the first time I've seen anything like this number of private sector, let alone finance sector participants, which I think is a very good thing and encouraging. And I think it shows that we're kind of getting more rooted in the real world of the markets and where the big money is, not just where small amounts of international finance may be flowing. So from your perspective, to kind of accelerate the things you've already been doing, what would be the, if you like, one or two most useful kind of signals that come out of this?
I would say is to see more participation amongst the NGOs and MDBs with the private sector to achieve, the outcomes that are being agreed. So I think more engagement with the private sector to do that, because there is a strong willingness. A lot of investors have kind of the requirement, but also I'd say the spiritual alignment of what everyone is trying to achieve. So it's kind of working with us to help make it, to help bring in the capital that's needed to achieve the outcomes.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much. I mean, to me, that's been a fascinating discussion around a complex and sort of interwoven set of themes. I mean, I'm not going to attempt to summarize, but just a few things that struck me listening to that were the importance of really trying to move to scale. Whatever you do, that doing innovative things is great, but you actually have to then mainstream it in the broadest sense, into the market, into public policy. It can't just be a little bit going on over here and everything else going in the wrong direction. So if you like, it's kind of the alignment of the whole process. So I think that's true about resources, but I felt it was also true about knowledge. And I heard a lot that was implicit in the discussion and sometimes explicit about the need for capacity building and the need for sharing. So even if resources are scarce, so is knowledge and expertise. And none of us have a monopoly on it. So it's really, really important that in these kind of issues, the maximum sharing of financial expertise, of policy expertise, of technical expertise, and it is really undertaken. So any ways in which that can be done seems very, very important. So I think we've heard a lot about innovation, a lot of commitment from all the members of the panel in their different organizations and in different ways. And I'd just like to thank them all very much for, I thought, a very interesting discussion. So thank you all. I think there's another breakout in here, but I'll let our coordinator tell you. Anyway, we'll leave the stage.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Thank you, Tracy, Alicia, Vanessa, Ramsey. This was really a great panel, very exciting discussions. Really great to have you with us. We are going to have another breakout session in this room in 10 minutes from now at 1:45. This will last 1 hour, and this will this will explore linkages between climate action and nature action, and climate transition plans and transition plans to nature positive, if I may use the word. This will be moderated by Jessica Smith, who will start this panel in a very short while. In room 230A, which is 30 seconds walk to the right of this room, there will be another panel moderated by Romy Godik of UNEP-FI on nature positive with, again, another impressive group of speakers. So please take time to choose your breakout session. We will reconvene in this room at 5 p.m. after the breakout sessions to hear Minister Goldsmith of Environment of the United Kingdom, CEO of Jeff, Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, and CEO of Domini Impact Investment, Carol Leibl, on to start our closing plenaries. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats as the event is about to begin.
Mesdames et messieurs, veuillez prendre place puisque la séance débutera dans quelques instants.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. We are in the breakout session on developing nature-positive pathways to align financial flows, building on synergies with net zero pathways. Finance and Biodiversity Day has already been extremely eventful. You may have seen the announcement from Emmanuel Faber this morning in the opening plenary around the IASB taking on natural ecosystems and just transition in its mandate, and the really powerful opening from Mark Carney, Inger Anderson, and others on this topic as well. So it's an exciting day, and we are now getting into the weeds, the practicalities of how we link nature positive with net zero transition pathways. So we have such a fantastic panel. I'm so glad to welcome you all today. We have Ms. Joy Williams, who's the Executive Director for North America of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, GFANZ. Ms. Valerie Noel Kodjo Diop, who's Director of Innovation and Sustainable Development at the West African Development Bank. Elizabeth Littlefield, who's Senior Partner at West Africa Blue and a Senior Advisor at Pollination. Xavier Michon, the Deputy Executive Secretary of the United Nations Capital Development Fund. And Mr. Brian Kernahan, Chief Sustainability Officer of Manulife Investment Management. I'm Jessica Smith. I lead work on nature and nature-based solutions at the UNEP Finance Initiative based in Geneva. We work across banking, insurance, and investment to try to leverage the mainstream financial sector towards the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement, and hopefully now the Global Biodiversity Framework when we hope to see it agreed in the coming days. So the topic of the links between nature positive and net zero has been explored from a lot of different angles. We are now going deeper into the practicalities of how do we design nature positive pathways that will aligned. So we're getting used to the idea of Paris-aligned financial portfolios. We may now be moving to Kunming, Montreal-aligned portfolios, hopefully after an agreement. So we are seeing investors talking about voluntary carbon markets still as the main driver of biodiversity finance from the private sector. There are sometimes, though, misaligned incentives. So I heard yesterday a very powerful intervention from Gabon, who were explaining that the concept of additionality limits countries like theirs who have maintained intact ecosystems. So Gabon is sequestering 100 million tons of CO2 over and above their emissions every single year, and they're not able to monetize this. We're actually currently incentivizing restoration, but not the management of intact ecosystems, which are sequestering much, much more carbon by different measures in different ecosystems. But we really need to change the guardrails and the incentives to align correctly with nature-based solutions. So first of all, I'd like to cover the topic of synergies and win-win opportunities. So, there are major opportunities in this space, as we heard some of the speakers earlier today outline. And I'd like to start with you, Joy, if you can talk to us a little bit about your work, both from inside an asset owner and GFANs on this topic.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. So while my current job is at GFANs, and we looked at the financial institutions' net zero transition planning, so in detail, what are the elements that goes into a credible plan, my background is actually in investments. And I just want to go back to that because something that you said about looking at preservation, that we're not monetizing that as a nature-based solution. But what it comes down to is financial institutions, they will look at any sort of relevant physical and transition risk when you're talking about climate change. And I've heard those terms being used for nature positive as well. So when you look at a specific financial opportunity and you're looking at risk management, this is an area where there's synergies. Because if they've made a net zero commitment, then in everything that they do, so strategically, they need to look and see where is it that they can emit less or reduce emissions. And preserving intact spaces around any opportunities would be one of those synergies. And then to take it further, within an entire strategy for a net zero transition, nature-based solutions is one obvious and direct way to link in nature with monetization, with commitments, and with accounting. So that is certainly something we recognized in the strategy, that this needs to be approached strategically to see how and where a financial institution is going to do this. Are they going to use it to compensate? Are they going to use it to neutralize? Is it going to be main part of their strategy? So all of this requires thought in order to get the entire institution thinking about and integrating nature with their net zero transition. So two ways to look at it: on an individual level and then on a strategic level as well.
Thank you, Joy. And now, Brian, if I can come to you. You are with Manulife Investment Management. You will have experience identifying climate risk, opportunities, and disclosure. How can FIs, given the big task ahead, cope with nature and climate together across these themes, risk, opportunities, and disclosure? And how do you see them building on each other in the nitty-gritty of your operations?
Let me turn it on there and get the gist here. So actually building on Joy's comment, so as an investment manager, fundamentally we manage risk. And I think the ability that we've been able to kind of accumulate as a community, an investment community, over climate risk is going to lead us into being able to add nature risk to that. So I think the fundamental question is, can we cope with it? Yeah, it's our job, right, as fiduciaries. I think the standard that we apply to this is really, we begin with materiality. And so, as Joy was saying, if climate is material to the business, which clearly it is, then we incorporate it. And that's even from the financial perspective. If you add double materiality to that, then you can add in the risk and the opportunities associated with the impact of climate change. That philosophy is becoming well ingrained. It's definitely well ingrained at Manulife. And nature, I believe, is going to allow us to do the same thing. And the fact that the two are so interconnected as we are starting to make the world more aware is going to give us an opportunity to strategically put the two together. So if we turn to kind of the practical, which I appreciate this panel looking at the practical, TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, quickly became the standard. That's helpful. TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, of which we are on the working group to say, should there be one, was yes, there should be. Should they have been done together so that we have some standardization and not two? Maybe. But I actually think having the pillars of nature standing alongside climate in these early days is really helpful, but they're structured the same. They look at strategy, governance, risk management, metrics, targets. So we can build a strategy to deal with two very material risks to our business. And I believe that it allows us to cope with it. We can disclose similarly on those, which also allows us to cope with it and really build strategies to execute on it. So,
Thank you, Brian. Now, Xavier, I'm going to come to you next. So we've had a couple interventions really talking about private finance, which really consider particularly the stocks of capital. And you are from the UN system, as am I, and we are both concerned with shifting the stocks of capital, but also immediately getting flows of nature-positive finance towards particularly the least developed countries and the countries that are most exposed to ecosystem damage. Can you talk to us a bit about the role that the UN system and our member states can play in delivering the nature-positive financial flows as soon as possible?
So it's a big question, and I'll try to answer in 3 minutes. And thank you for asking it. So first of all, I've heard, and I had the opportunity, like many of you, to attend and just to hear a little bit what has been said. And what I've heard so far is talking about action based on the different interaction that we're having here, about scale, about the interventions, about, of course, financing that derives from it, and of course synergies. And I think that's an important element based on coalitions. And I think that's where we can have some elements of reflection. Also heard also about the concept that nature is to be seen not as just as a resource, but as an asset. That's something that we can not only benefit from, but invest in and develop models that are self-sustainable and they can, let's say, sustain themselves because there's a revenue model around it where that has also impact. And finally is that there are instruments that do exist and they can be utilized, and where you can have different, let's say, participants with different tolerances in terms of risk that they can intervene. So this is a lot of equations with a lot of parameters, if I can say, and that's where the member states and the UN can fit in as an element of bringing everybody around the table and finding solutions that where there's a division of role. I think a good understanding of what the challenge at hand or the opportunity that we're facing is, and how we do something about it. So that's, I think, one of the elements that is, I said, at the core of who we are in terms of UN and together with, of course, with the member states. The second point is, if you will see, and I think I'm thinking about what has, after the FFD conference in Addis, I think the expressions in terms of impact investing, in terms of pipeline of bankable projects, in terms of liaising with the private sector, they are appearing everywhere. I think it's part of the lingo of whomever we are, whatever we do, it's something that we start to embed into who we are. And there are instruments that have been deployed. We are, as part of the UN family, an entity that is specialized on the finance side. So we are actually deploying foreign balance sheet loans and guarantees and other financial instruments at the sub-sovereign level. And I think there are instruments that today have been tested, that they're being used as proof of concept and hopefully replicated in many instances. And I'm sure we'll have the opportunity to talk about that. And so there are blended approaches that, with multiple solutions behind it. connection with investment funds. We have just presented something in the previous session. Nature performance bonds. There's a conversation about debt swaps, and of course, something that needs to be, let's say, fine-tuned and discussed in greater length in terms of what the biodiversity credits mean and what it entails and how do we define the model around it. So there are things that are happening, and I do believe that what we need is a couple of quick wins to show that some are delivering the promise in terms of impact effect, but also in terms of the viability of the investment. And there are some very good initiatives around, we among them, and we do believe that that's something that is important. And the last point maybe, and I'll stop there, is that today we see that there are very good initiatives, but they don't know how to access capital. So it's not only how to deploy capital, have the architecture, the instruments, the coalitions, the division of labors, and everything around it, but also how to, let's say, empower, how to bring capacity to those that are seeking financing. And whether it's conservation society that is looking for financing to its program, natural forest, conservation park, etc., etc. We see that when they have to talk to capital, they have to talk to a certain way. They have to present their idea a certain way. They have to talk in terms of viability of a project, which is also in terms of the financing. And like I heard from someone from the impact investment industry, basically the person told me they have to know how to dress to the party. And I think part of the work we have to do is also how to empower those that are seeking financing to also to access different forms of financing. So I'll stop there since we have plenty of opportunities, but maybe one thing, we have ourselves being also an entity which plays on the finance more than on the development side. We have just created a new strategy, a full-fledged pillar on energy, of course, climate and biodiversity finance, and actually we have just established a nature assets team, which is an expression of a little bit what's going on, our attention to that subject matter that we all share and we pay attention to. So it's also an expression of also that the UN is gearing up, is also coordinating, and also is playing its own role in terms of the contribution to the work that we're all trying to put together. Thank you.
Wonderful. Those are great insights. And your point about the quick wins and the proof of concepts, it aligns very much with what Eric Usher said in the plenary this morning. We need just a little bit of innovative finance to prove the case, and then we need a lot of boring finance. Great. So Valerie, Noel, you're with the West African Development Bank, and development banks have specialized in the use of insurance and guarantees to leverage private finance. We do hear a lot about nature-based solutions for mitigation. Are you thinking about adaptation finance and ecosystems that could be restored with development finance in your region?
Thank you, for the questions. So maybe, before answering, I just want, to maybe, people doesn't know really, what is the West African Development Bank. So maybe, everybody knows about, the African Development Bank, but they don't know about the West African Development Bank. So we are, the shareholding, the bank is, the central bank of West Africa, and also, the 8 shareholding, from, West African country. We are our aim and our DNA is development and also integration. I think it's quite important, and impact. Impact, is and sustainability are at the epicenter of our mandate. We are not regulated, but we are, in fact, because we are rated and we're looking, for capital market. So we are on a very awkward situation whereby we have to comply with investors that would buy our paper. So we need to comply with ESG, for sure. And when we're looking at the rating, of the institution, we have an ESG rating as well. And on the other side, we have also, to support development, for our country and shareholders. And sometimes there's some sort of conflict. And where, nature, could be something extremely powerful, is nature can be viewed as a solution, to climate. And it is part of the solution of the just transition. And we're very happy to see that African countries are happy, are, equipped, with elements of nature such as forestry, but also ocean. and they'll be able, to develop themselves, and even it's this kind of right for emission that can be compensated by element of nature that need to be protected and preserved. So I think that's something, which is very important. And in that respect, we've decided, to mainstream, biodiversity the same way we've done it, with the climate. And to be consistent, in all the different, steps of our strategy, from governance, strong commitment, from the leader, of the institution, of the COMEX, and the COTIR and all these people. We need also, to have building, capacity, especially, to have, some of our originator that will originate, deal which are, nature positive, deals. So that's something which is important. We've decided as well to be part of the task force on nature, in order to do, all the disclosure. And we thought it was really important to have a kind of African voice that we didn't have, previously, on the climate. And we want to be sure that there will be a kind of African taxonomy, in order, to be not too much specific, though, otherwise nobody will understand. But we need to add a little bit of our specificity, in Africa. So this is part of our strategy in mainstreaming, biodiversity. On the other side, we want on the risk management side, which is the greening finance, we want as well, to be extremely strict. And we've all heard, from the rating agency, environment and social risk management. And we want to do that for climate, but we want to extend it as well to biodiversity. And we've done an exercise that was quite interesting when we've been looking at the footprint of our portfolio, with regard to the climate. And we've tried to do the same for biodiversity. And it was quite amazing to see that the same sectors had the same impact both on climate and on biodiversity. So it tells a lot about, the way we're going to streamline, biodiversity on our. But to come back, to your original question that was, on the adaptation side. Yes, of course, we've financed, integrated project, which are on same time, combining climate smart agriculture, restoration of degraded soil through plantation of local species. And we've used, different, instruments such as guarantee and concessional loans as well. So that's part of the adaptation that we've done.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that great insight. I'm going to come to you next, Elizabeth. So you have been head of the USDFI, and you're now both investing in and implementing nature-based solution projects on the ground. So what do you see as the challenges to catalyzing capital flows for nature and biodiversity, and how does climate fit in?
Thanks very much, Jessica. Well, actually, such is my excitement about the synergies between climate and nature that I've actually decided to go from the global level, where I spent most of my career, down to, as you say, down to implementing things on the ground in West Africa, in fact. And I just do. I mean, clearly the synergies are obvious. You're protecting habitats that shelter maximum amount of biodiversity, and then sequester at the same time the maximum amount of carbon. And, while, of course, nature-based solutions are about far, far more than just carbon, for me, the great irony is that it's really the corporate net zero commitments that have actually driven the voluntary carbon markets out of the doldrums, such that many threatened areas can now be protected, such that many, the threatened areas that had no chance of protection before, biodiversity that was collapsing can now be restored. And of course, communities that were living at the edge can now have revenues that they would never have otherwise. So that's why I'm jazzed about it and doing it kind of full time. But I got to say that the nature-based carbon is incredibly difficult, especially working at the frontier in places that are very poor, like West Africa, parts of West Africa. Also working at the frontiers in terms of things like blue carbon, where pollination, where I'm working as well, has been an incredible contributor there, and really shown a lot of leadership with the Indus Delta project in Pakistan, especially. So the opportunities for me are enormous for climate, for nature, and for communities, and it can be self-financing, which of course nothing that I know in the 35 years I've been in development really had that kind of symbiosis that could be self-financing. However, I want to just list and not go into, but we can come later to some of the challenges that I think people aren't as aware of, as they think that this may be a panacea. And maybe these are reflected more in the bit more difficult markets. But so the challenges for me of financing, nature with biodiversity and climate is, number one, on the policy side, both Locally, you have issues like land tenure and tax and conveyance of carbon rights. But at the global level, things like uncertainties around Article 6, around corresponding adjustments, really big question, and again, an area where pollination is a super expert. Really, number two, science. The science is uncertain, and you get different answers from different people, no matter how great they are or how expert they are in their field. Remote sensing, when you're dealing with things like blue carbon, where a lot of the carbon is stored underground, really doesn't help you much. You don't get economies of scale. You got to actually, test place by place. The institutional infrastructure, there's been much discussion about the fact that the institutional infrastructure is really ill-equipped to intermediate between the enormous supply and the enormous demand right now. Whether it's the verifiers, the validators, the raters, or the developers, they are beleaguered and they can't handle it. It's a rickety infrastructure that's not going to withstand the pressures of this market. And then fourth, frankly, the methodologies are in flux, so you don't really know which one you're supposed to be focusing on. You mentioned Gabon. I mean, the fact that there's no methodology around intact forests, for me, is heresy, because that's the most important thing we have to protect. And then last, the issue about catalytic capital, which is incredibly scarce. And so given how long it takes to develop these projects till you get to revenue positive flows, a lot of developers are now doing something that is, they have no choice, but selling carbon forward at a very deep discount, which means they're basically taking money out of the pockets of communities and giving it to corporates. And I don't think that's what we meant. So I think that's one of the five challenges I would mention, but I just quickly say as I close that, I mean, it's super clear what we need to do, and it's not that hard. We need local policy makers, especially in the developing countries, to get guidance as to how do they navigate this world, how do they develop a domestic framework for carbon markets. We need models of high integrity, benefit sharing agreements, and other kinds of documents that can be shared generously so that the whole sector can grow together in a high integrity way. We need much more rigorous and practical institutional infrastructure. And finally, we need that catalytic capital that can help these markets develop up until the point they can earn revenue. So that's what I'm seeing on the bottom up.
Wonderful. And that's a message we often hear from our members in the banking, insurance, investment sector, is that, they want to deploy capital to nature, but, where is the de-risking support, at the pace and at the scale that we need it? So I want to now look at the lessons that we've learned from the climate space, particularly climate markets. So last week, if some of you were here last week, actually there were protests outside of the COP venue, and we were momentarily held indoors while the protests were continuing outdoors. And some people said, why are there protests at a convention for nature? Who's against nature? Well, I don't think anyone's against nature, but there were concerns about the financialization of nature and who benefits from this. And we've seen in the case of climate finance that less than 1% of climate finance has reached Indigenous and local communities who are frontline stewards of the irrecoverable carbon. There's a concern that we don't repeat the same for nature finance. There's also a risk if we start to financialize nature and create values in markets where communities don't have secure tenure. There's risks of land grabs or other knock-on effects that are unintentional. So how are we going to do nature finance better? How are we going to do it on the back of the lessons that have been learned from the carbon market? How are we going to make sure that the safeguards are there at the right time and the right place? Now, Xavier, I'd love to hear from you examples of initiatives where blended finance or innovative financial mechanisms are unlocking nature positive investments that are just. So how can we be building on the experiences of climate finance, for example, around the Indigenous people and local communities, not only being involved as beneficiaries, but proponents, but making sure there's safeguards there. And I know you do a lot of work on coral reefs, and we know that 1 billion people rely to some degree on their livelihood for coral reefs. So I think it would be wonderful to hear an example of that if you have one.
You know that I have one. Uh, so I'll start with the coral reef. So as you know, so this is what we're working on, and we hear a lot. We have to. This is what we are doing, and so there are some preliminary results. So we are working on a global coral reef fund. Actually, it's the largest blended finance mechanism that is covering the vulnerable, let's say, coral nations. We're currently in 12 countries. It's going from the Caribbean down to the South Pacific, and of course the coasts in East Africa and West Africa. And we expanding to 23 countries over the next, I think, year. I think we have mobilized, and I'm doing that under the scrutiny of the team that is here with me and looking at me, but I don't look at them, so I can say whatever I want. But I think about $120 million, and actually we're leveraging also another financing for a component to this portfolio, and then are working on the deployment from our balance sheet of grants to de-risk investments, but also loans and guarantees to bring them to another scale and get them closer to other forms of let's say, of capital that is, let's say, a little bit more risk averse and closer to commercial terms. And this is to promote an ecosystem that is linked to the restoration of the coral reefs, bringing tourism and bring an ecosystem that is positive along those lines. This is a coalition which, again, I'm saying that under scrutiny, with about 10 partners, if not more, between member states, public institutions, but also the private sector. And I think that's an expression that, there's something that has been made. It has been capitalized. It exists. It is deploying. It has underlying, let's say, assets that have been today supported and are showing not only results in terms of a return and a risk relationship, but also a changing lives where basically they've been deployed. So that's the first one. The second thing I just wanted to say that at the COP in Sharm el-Sheikh, it was just announced that the Central African Forest Initiative has appointed or nominated UNCDF as its investment agent, and this is to issue forest performance bonds in the Congo Basin region, and that's something that also we are starting as of now. And finally, maybe two other examples, and just to show that the investment doesn't go only, let's say, in the easier market, but here we have, for example, an initiative in North Burundi. So we're talking about the Kibera forest in the north of the country, which is basically one of the few places where there are still some trees left. I had the chance to work there for a couple of years. And of course, in South Kivu, so on the DRC side, which is adjacent in the Kahuzi-Biega National Park, whereby basically we have also a blended finance mechanism whereby basically we support initiative in terms of the energy production that then have a return revenue that then promotes basically conservation, participation of the local populations. We know that these areas also that are crossed by armed groups, and so there are complexities around it. But this is something that we are deploying and also has obtained an important financing, and we're doing with several partners. So these are a couple of expressions. Just wanted to say that capital can go, and blended finance approach can go into geographies, into countries that maybe we haven't thought about that, and results can be achieved, and we're looking forward to report back to you in terms of what it goes. And maybe one last thing, because I'm insisting also not just on the way to deploy capital, establishing instruments that de-risk and then entice capital to come at different stages. We do believe that the role of the UN in terms of intermediating with seekers of capital that have good ventures, that are nature positive, and investors is important. So we have just launched and we're testing in 2 countries. And so apologies if I'm using that term, but you will, in 3 words, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. A site which is a Tinder for investors and investees. And basically, we even go to the limit that we do assess, and we do an assessment of the enterprises that are promoting the project with an algorithm, so it provides an initial assessment to the investors so that basically they can see if there are some basic parameters to make the connection. So again, these are a couple of examples. I'm sure there's much more, but I just wanted to talk about things that are going on and not something that we wish for. These are concrete examples. They finance, and I think they're already delivering results, and we will be happy to talk about it in parallel these conversations. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. And Valerie Noel, if you wouldn't mind, if we can just segue to you based on Xavier's comments. I think what he is pointing out is the development benefits around financing nature and addressing climate change through nature-based solutions. Now, you mentioned some investments into ecosystems. How does the West African Development Bank consider, the Indigenous peoples and local communities at the front line of stewardship? How do you make sure that those who are stewarding nature are benefiting from those financial flows?
Okay, as I explained to you, the client that we have, thank you. As I explained to you, the client that we have are the states. We extended, to the private sector. But something, in order, to enlarge our reach, to the population, is through the refinancing lines that we're having, with commercial banks and with microfinance, as well. And another thing as well that I would like, to say is that anytime that we go for financing, we have, impact team, which are assessing, what will be the impact of our financing on population. And we give some sort of compensation. For instance, when we are extending funds for the mining industry, and it could have impact, on the population, we compensate them. So the way, we have found ourselves, to be able, just to be sure that the fund, has been extended, to the population for the benefit of the population is the way, we do it. Another example maybe that I just want, to give is that we've promoted, an initiative which is the Ocean Hackathon. Ocean, the blue economy is something quite important, for me. You want to say something? Okay. Blue economy is something, very important, and we've done the hackathon, and we had some winner. We are a small little startup because we love, the initiative to do some proof of concept, and then after to have an MVP, and then after, to scale up, in other country. So we're going to experiment and design, the solution in a specific country that BOAD is covering. And now we rely on the ecosystem of BOAD. We have some incubator, which are part of our ecosystem. And we call it, open innovation. What we could not do, we ask our partnership, to help and we had some support, from incubators, just to help people to design, the solution. So that's another way as well to do it. We don't have direct, access to the beneficial, but we're trying to put all our ecosystem, in motion in order to be able, to be sure that, there's benefits, for the population.
Great. Elizabeth, do you want to react to that? Are you?
I was percolating on your other question earlier.
Okay, go ahead.
So, thank you for that. I was just percolating on your question about both IPLSCs, but also what the lessons from climate finance are relative to nature finance. And first on the indigenous people, at least from my perspective, the communities are absolutely at the very center of this whole market. They're making the decisions. They're driving the solutions. They own the land in most cases, and the idea is not to convince them to have a better way of life that isn't as destructive of nature, but to help them see other opportunities that they may not have had before to lead a better life. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a very different and subtle difference. So, anyway, I think it's incredibly important to have this be community centric, and it's shocking to me when I realize that it's incredibly hard to find a benefit sharing agreement among the carbon market, in the voluntary carbon markets, that's transparent and public. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Almost impossible. And the verifiers right now don't even ask for it. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So for me, number one thing is we need to get clear on the benefit sharing agreement, make them public, make them available, and make sure that they're fair and equitable for Indigenous communities. But just on the question of what we learned from climate finance and how it's different from what we're looking at now in nature finance. I was very involved in the early days with climate finance because it was being driven by renewable energy, and we were so proud of ourselves at OPIC or DFC to see vast volumes of financing going to the renewable energy sector in emerging markets. We grew tenfold in a couple of years. We were doing $3 billion a year in financing. But in retrospect, it was super easy because, frankly, the cost curve was coming with us. It was, we had the wind at our backs in terms of costs. There was huge demand from clients for it. You had experienced developers, relatively simple business models, So it was pretty straightforward. Of course, there was always a challenge of working with local governments who had to wrap their head around being an off-taker and developing a bankable power purchase agreement. But basically, commercial forces were driving climate finance, and that's not the case here, where you have the projects are fundamentally kind of hard to finance, right? They're small, they're slow in paying back, they're in risky, scary places for some. The really complex stakeholder groups, both local and global, and again, the business models are complex. So it's different, but I think the one benefit that nature now has, nature finance has, that climate finance didn't have, is that 10 years ago we didn't have the sense of urgency at all, and now we have the benefit of that sense of urgency, piggybacking, of course, on the recognition of the role of climate change, and we also didn't have the triple benefits, if you will, that can be garnered from financing nature, climate, communities, and nature and biodiversity. So, I keep thinking if we can clarify the rules of the road, we can create high integrity, publicly available, fair, rigorous markets, and we can build the institutional infrastructure and the right kind of capital at the right place at the right time. To come into your point about blended finance, I think we can scale it fast, and we have to.
I think that's great insight. And Brian, if I can come to you next, from your perspective, do you see it as realistic for nature finance to scale like climate finance has? And given what you've heard and your own insights, what would be your concerns and recommendations for handling the social and environmental risks around this?
So I'll keep my comments on this one specific to carbon markets as what many see as kind of a climate finance mechanism, because and I'll use it particularly in forestry, which is one of our nature businesses, if you will, largest manager of institutional forest land in the world. And I would say that while the carbon markets have accelerated to the point and the value has risen to the point that it can be a mechanism to kind of use forest and nature-based solutions for climate change, I would say there is great risk in it. And I would go so far as to say I hope we don't look to financing nature through simply the market. Because I think it's been said already, right? There's criticism. A lot of the protests that you see around this are exactly as you described coming in, that apparently were here last week when I wasn't here. There's a lot of concern over the credibility, the transparency, as Elizabeth was saying, relative to those markets. There are other ways to have capital move towards nature and climate, such as investing in nature directly. Right? No reason to take a forest. So we were investing in forests. Why would we necessarily have to simply create a carbon project on it to then have a revenue stream effectively from climate change? What we're trying to do now is look at the forest in and of itself as an investment in climate change, because we can manage forests in a way that sequester more carbon, and you don't have to trade them in that third-party transaction. You actually just account for them very similarly and using the same methodologies as you would to transact, but you eliminate that arm's length transaction, the exchange of money, and you retire those carbon credits yourself and invest in it directly. So therein lies the ability to drive more capital, we believe, that is not market contingent, to actually have direct investment in nature, whether it's agriculture or forestry, et cetera, that I think is a more scalable and potentially less risky opportunity to do that. I'll then also say is that if we can do that, and a lot of the project finance discussions that have been going on here are about financing nature. I also would remind us, though, that we have to solve the nature challenge and crisis within value chains, within the gray infrastructure. And the same model of actually investing directly in a nature positive or nature accretive asset would be in real estate. So let's invest in nature positive buildings where it's net zero. So now you've got the climate and nature directly. So you can attack the nature crisis, not just by helping to protect nature and restore nature, but actually going to where we're using nature, use it more wisely and with less impact, like in the gray infrastructure, where you're actually investing in, green gray infrastructure or greener infrastructure in the built environment, like in green buildings. So I think there's some perils if we follow simply the quick path to biodiversity credits being the revenue stream, or to use that as the example, but rather take a step back and say there's a lot more capital that I think would flow to investing direct.
Thank you. Now, Joy, GFANS has started work on deforestation, which is very exciting. I would love to hear a bit more from you on that. But also just taking a step back and looking at the path that the climate has taken from sort of a niche ESG issue that can be often managed on the side of somebody's desk to now becoming really a strategy issue. We actually heard quite a lot from Keith Truffley from Citi this morning in the plenary about, the business opportunities around the transition that they see as a commercial bank. How is nature already on that pathway? And why might it be easier for nature now that climate has forged the way?
There we go. Let me turn my mic off. So I agree with everything the other panelists said. So I'm going to give you, I think, a positive lesson learned from climate, and also, I think, a negative lesson learned from climate, just to be slightly controversial. So the positive lesson learned, and we did this with deforestation, was in order to scale things, we needed to get whole institutions involved with this. So it isn't like one product line within an institution or one person doing it off the side of the desks. I should say, I used to work in the carbon markets like 20 years ago, and the growth in the carbon markets back then was painful. It was so slow, it was painful. So how do you actually scale not just carbon credits, as Elizabeth has already said, all the things that are needed, but across the entire, everything that they do, as Brian was saying, like in every decision. So what climate has done over the last 8 years is move from a single person doing it because it's their personal passion off the side of their desk for whichever analyst they can convince should look at this, into having the entire institution do it in a strategic manner by having a business plan around it. So that's how you scale things. And climate change has forged that path that nature, I think, will follow quite quickly. A negative lesson learned that I would say, to be slightly contrary, is that the overfocus on emissions as the apex metric for climate change, I think, has actually slowed us down in some respects. It's still needed. You absolutely need to count your emissions. But what GFANS noted this year when we were doing this work is we started to ask ourselves, okay, if we're doing net zero transition or commitments for financial institutions, what is actually the role of finance here? And the role of finance is to move capital, public or private, it's to move capital where it's needed. So emissions didn't actually do that when you count it year on year. So we thought about, okay, so what is needed for the net zero transition? There's 4 buckets. You have to support climate solutions. You have to support companies who have already been on this pathway or who have committed and they're working on the pathway. And you have to retire high emitting assets. And by putting that lens, those definitions on that type of lens, this is where transition finance, that's how we defined it, had to go. And if we had had that, say, 5 years ago, what would have looked like? What would have been different? So for nature, and I've heard that, there's tons of metrics that nature you need to track. And that is absolutely true. That is how you show the progress. But when you're talking about moving finance to nature, what is that simple definition, which is a lens to which you can apply every single financial decision? And I would maybe suggest that it's preserve nature, restore nature. And if you can look at your decisions, maybe that's too simple, but as a starter idea, if you can look at your financial decisions with that lens, does that help to start move the capital? That would be my positive lesson learned and potentially a negative lesson learned.
Oops, great. And, when we talk about carbon in the atmosphere, you can debit and credit. You have emissions and you have sequestration, and a ton is a ton. But with nature, we don't. It's more apples and oranges. We don't have that measurable up and down to the same degree. We've been hearing such a lot about carbon credits across this COP, and particularly in the business and finance pavilion and the nature positive pavilion. This is a really, really hot topic. And some are saying maybe we should be calling these carbon or nature biodiversity certificates rather than credits, to avoid the idea of a debiting and crediting. And I've heard the idea of maybe biodiversity markets should be more like real estate markets, where it's location that really matters. So we are heading towards two major landmark agreements in this space. We hope if the negotiators can conclude this agreement, we will have both the Paris Agreement and we will have the Kunming-Montreal, or whatever the final name is, Global Biodiversity Framework, which will really be sort of North Stars to guide what are society's expectations from the financial sector. Now, the pace of climate COPs is once a year, and the normal pace of biodiversity COPs is every 2 years. Now, as we see the convergence of these topics, we do see, also the UN Environment Assembly, which is universal participation, so all the governments of the world, agreed a definition earlier this year on nature-based solutions, which in the legal UN hierarchy is higher than the two conventions. So it sort of becomes an umbrella over the conventions. So as we see the convergence of these two issues and the solutions focus, I would love to hear if we could just do a lightning round. Maybe I can go down the table this way. What would you like to see? Just a quick headline by the next climate COP and by the next biodiversity COP to really accelerate nature and climate finance together.
Great. So for by the next climate COP, which is next year in the UAE, I think scoping where exactly are the interactions between climate and nature so that it provides clarity to everyone working on them. By the next biodiversity COP, really at the end of this one, I would love to see that 2.1C Paris moment in the global biodiversity framework, again, to give clarity and direction to everyone working on this issue.
Thank you. Elizabeth?
Yeah, I love your idea of certificates, especially. I'm going to come to the lightning round just because I'm hearing more and more that people care really more, that increasingly people will care more about the co-benefits than the carbon itself, and that the value of that credit is going to be tilted towards those co-benefits. So I think that's a fantastic direction. I mean, for me, I don't know how many people here had taxi cab drivers or cousins or colleagues say like, COP 15? Wait, didn't that just happen in Sharm? And so I think for me, the idea that that biodiversity is finally understood to be, the twin sister to climate, connected, intertwined, interdependent, mutually supportive, and, that both are existentially threatened, but the damage to biodiversity is far less reversible. And so it's even more important that we focus on biodiversity.
Thank you. Brian?
So I won't give the headlines because I'd rather just focus on the actions that we need to take. So coming out of both of them, either in tandem or preferably once we see progress on both, particularly this particular agreement, we have to have that clear signal from government that we have to incentivize the private sector to start measuring. And I don't mean just the biodiversity, which is challenging. More challenging is start to realize, are we measuring the right thing for climate? So I like your point there. Start disclosing, because if we don't start disclosing, then we will not hold ourselves accountable. It's human nature. And this may be heresy with some of my business friends, but be prepared to get regulated. Also human nature is that if we don't accept rational, I'll add that caveat to it, rational regulation that puts expectations on the private sector relative to its performance against both climate and nature, it will be a very long road. If you think about accounting without standards, Or would we be? And that came about through regulation. So measure, disclose, regulate. Let's get on with it.
Great, thank you. Valerie Noel?
I would say that engage all stakeholders, and I'm thinking about Africa as a stakeholders, especially on nature. I think this one will be extremely important. I think that matching resources, with the ambition, and to be realistic about, in the figure that we're going to disclose. It's better to be realistic than, having some sort of commitment that we'll never reach. And also the disclosure is going, with the accountability. I think this one will be extremely important to prevent any sort of nature batching, if I may.
Thank you. Now, Xavier?
Yeah, it's the difficulty of being last. Yes, there are so many initiatives that have been discussed, and that we all know about. I think that these are the quick wins that we're talking about, and that can have to prove themselves and show results. So, if in the next session we can come back and say what have they done, and if they work, how we can scale them up and replicate them, that would be something very tangible that we can really touch with our own hands and see if that's applicable to other spaces and it has worked. So I would be very interested in having some kind of feedback mechanism on the initiatives that are circulating in all the corridors here that we'll hear about. It would be very interesting. Over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, I feel like we've covered quite a lot of ground. There really is an opportunity that we can learn from the climate finance space. We can build from the climate finance space. Climate finance can support nature-based solutions, and we can move better and faster than we could have imagined before, given the groundwork that's already been laid. And I heard Inger Anderson, really recognize Mark Carney's role in this space in terms of all this groundwork that's there that we're able to build on. So we are going to be heading into a session at 5 p.m., which is about building ambition for the financing of biodiversity. So I hope that the plenary session will build on the discussion that we've had here. It will resume at 5 p.m. We're going to have the Right Honourable Lord Goldsmith, who's Minister of State for Energy, Climate and Environment from the UK, Mr. Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, the CEO of the Global Environment Facility, and I find him a particularly dynamic and charming person, so I do hope you stay. And Ms. Carol Label, who's the CEO of Domini Impact Investment. And we're going to have Ms. Anita DeHorde as the moderator. So Anita is one of the co-founders of the Finance for Biodiversity Foundation. Today, they've announced 15 more signatories across banking, insurance, investment. The foundation and the pledge have been, enormous champions of biodiversity in the finance sector. And we've been working with them also on a statement from private finance from the pledge signatories, UNEPIFI members, and PRI members, which we continue to gather signatories for to show the negotiators that private finance is here. Private finance wants to play its role. It needs a clear goal D, and it needs clear targets within 19 to direct its efforts. But private finance is here and wants to make a contribution, and development finance wants to leverage as much private finance as possible to the table as well. Thank you very much for joining our breakout group today. I hope it's been an enjoyable experience, and thank you to the fantastic panel here.
Jim on English sound check. Thank you.